Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Ardis, host of the Dr. Ardis Show. This is the Dr. Ardis Show. I hope you're having a phenomenal week, a phenomenal day. I just returned back from England, 5 days, 6 presentations in 3 days at an amazing health conference put on by the Good Food Project. And big shout out to all of them out there. The Scots, the Welsh, the English, they were all phenomenal hosts. And the entire audience was just a blessing to be around, and your energy was contagious. And thanks for buoying Jane and I up and welcoming us to your country and that area of Manchester, which was just beautiful there in the UK. So anyway, God bless all of you there in the UK. You know we love you, as they tried to murder all of your loved ones and senior citizens with midazolam and create a narrative they called COVID-19 viral infections. Anyway, it's been a big lift, and I'm very, very excited for those around the world who support what we do here. Now, early on, I became pretty controversial talking about snake venom in water. If you remember the documentary Stu Peters and I put out in 2022, early 2022, called Watch the Water. And there was an individual that I introduced my audiences to, and that I was introduced to through an email that he had sent to a whole bunch of docs and scientists that were a part of a huge group that Peter McCullough, I, and Paul Alexander had actually created. And only to realize that the day before doing this interview with Stu Peters to produce that documentary, someone else had already actually figured out the connection to the symptoms of COVID-19 being identical, very specifically to the toxic side effects, signs, and symptoms of someone who's had king cobra venom introduced into their body. And he had presented that email and the documentations to that group, and then he was ostracized from that group. I just had no idea. There was thousands of people contributing emails there, but that individual was Dr. Tau Braun. And Tau Braun, I literally the very next week was in New Jersey, met with him. That's where he lives, and had a private meeting with him in a hotel lobby. And I wanted to know as much as he knew, and if he knew as much as I knew. And we shared our research together, and we've done documentaries together. We have done docuseries together, interviews together. And I think it's time for a update. Full circle. It's been a few years. It's only been like 4 years. Can you believe it's already 2026? That was in 2022. Tau Braun. Let's bring on Tau Braun. How are you, Dr.
What
Tau
a ride.
Braun?
What a ride it's been.
What a ride.
Unbelievable. Yeah, I mean,
Actually, fill us in on your background, Dr. Tau Braun. How is it that you came up 6 months before I ever even decided I was going to talk to anybody about what I was uncovering and unearthing? You had already published the information, packaged it up, sent it to an email to a whole group of docs, and they were like, whoa. Cancel culture, even in the truther movement, get out. We're not talking about that. We're only talking about bat viruses. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so, very, very short version of this is that my work before the pandemic had all related for the last decade before the pandemic was related to the prevention and response to mass killings. And that's a very, very niche group that's dedicated to the science of understanding what drives people to, have the obsessions and compulsions to decide that they want body count. They want dead people. It's not even about injuries. The predominant amount of the predominant times that you interview or when they talk about going and after this tragedy, they talk about, first question they often ask is like, how many people did I kill? Because it's, when they've lived or they don't, when they don't suicide. So very dark stuff. But my contribution to it, similar to the pandemic, was to poke holes at the theory, to call out the BS when I saw it, to become the person, even into the response side, when they were rolling out the run, hide, fight model, going, why are you getting people to stay in a room somewhere with drywall and they right next to an exit? It was one of the things that I used to say in every presentation, like studying these and looking to see like where people had actually lost their lives. And I'm like, you creating a kill box, like you're sending these people. Of course, there's times where just like an animal running away from a predator, like, yeah, you freeze or you hide or you try and create some cover. But I was like, I don't understand this model. You're literally putting these people into a room and then they're locking themselves in there and then it's drywall. This is not, this is real life. Like, and so even then, like I became a controversial figure, but the great thing about doing that is that over time, I built up a reputation for being the truth teller. And so just before the pandemic actually started, it was the fall of 2019 that actually had hit a pretty big pinnacle for me. And I got invited to the Texas Senate to do I did 2 hours of invited testimony on the subject of the prevention and response to mass killings. So put simply, I was one of the go-to guys in terms of understanding threat assessment, threat management, as it relates to people that wake up and decide that they want to kill a bunch of people. And that put me into the pandemic in 2020, when straight off the bat in that first quarter of 2020, my clients, which were big corporations, massive healthcare systems, state level clients, county level clients, a lot of those people were like, "Doc, is this a bioweapon? We're hearing that this is potentially a bioweapon." That's the first deep dive that I started taking, because I couldn't just, guess. I wanted to give a professional answer to that. And of course, it didn't take more than just like a week or two. And I was like, "Yep, this is a bioweapon." And then part of that was, just breaking it up, breaking that spike protein and understanding what we're dealing with and what are the mechanisms. And then realizing two things. One, you referred to already, which is that you and I both looked at the venom analogs and said, wait, hold on. Why is no one talking about nicotinic receptors? Why is no one talking about nicotine and all of that stuff? But part of it as well is that right at the beginning, I realized that the pathology was being driven by this sequence that they've given us, but you did not need a virus, that it was you're dealing with a highly toxic protein. And at the time, I was describing it as a neurotoxic, cardiotoxic, and oncogenic protein. More recently, I've also been describing it as a transmissible prion, which is very unfortunate. And we can get into some of that and what that means for humanity and mitigation strategies against that. But that's even more concerning, for people that don't believe in viruses. I got to tell you, you can not believe in viruses, but prion is some pretty scary stuff, right? And the progression of that is really quick, really horrible. And
describe to my audiences what prions are.
Okay, so when you have proteins and they're going to be stored somewhere, they're going to be made and they're going to be used and they're going to be stored. You can have a couple of issues that can cause misfolding. Misfolding can happen from high levels of oxidative stress. Things like radiation, very toxic medications can cause protein misfolding. The spike protein causes misfolding, but differently from when I say misfolding, it's the difference between when you buy a box of spaghetti and it's long and cylindrical and it fits in the box, and you put it in the water and you stir it around, and the next thing you've got noodles and they're all over the place and they twisted and they tangled, right? And so if you needed them in a straight line form, you could sit for hours and you could take your twisted and untangled noodles and you could straighten them out again. Now, the crazy thing is with prion, and this is where it gets a little sci-fi, a little quantum-like, differently from proteins that replicate. Prion does this really weird thing where it would be the equivalent of having a pot on the stovetop with noodles in it, and they're all tangled up, and you didn't want them like that. And then you had noodles in the pot next to it, and you looked over, and those noodles had now tangled themselves just like the others. And then you put another pot on the stovetop, and that third one looks just like that first one. So what happens is they take on a shape, and then the other proteins start copying that misfolded shape. And so that's not replication. That is misfolding by mimicry. And very, very detrimental to the human body. So the spike protein,
very deadly. If you look at prion diseases, death is one of the most known, well-documented issues with prion diseases.
And people know it as mad cow, right? So that's one of the things people recognize. So the spike protein has sequences on it that are amyloidic and prion-like. And that's one of the things that we're seeing. currently an uptick in people that have been diagnosed with ALS. That more than likely is two main drivers. One, that can actually come from depletion of copper, where you're not producing enough of the substance that I've looked at the most over the last 6 years, SOD1, superoxide dismutase, as a powerful antioxidant. And all these fancy words, just call them what they are. It's an anti-rust, right? Stops the body rusting from the iron toxicity. So if you don't have the right copper zinc, as you know, you don't have the right copper zinc ratio, you deplete it in one or the other, you're going to not make SOD1 correctly. You're going to make mutated forms of SOD1. They're going to be unbalanced. And one of the genetic links to SOD1 is actually ALS. So when those ratios can get really bad, you can get ALS-like disease. And I think a lot of what's happening currently, which is pretty scary and sad, is that I think a lot of people are getting a diagnosis of ALS, and it's more than likely prion, which is terrifying. Part of what what changed for me is starting to look at the mechanisms of how this thing enters our system. And I became fascinated by the fact that that the olfactory bulbs in our nasal passages and that whole entry point, you can think of that whole biological region of our nose is obviously not just for inhaling, but it's like having sensors. And it's sensing and sniffing, and this is why pheromones have an impact on us, and this is why tiny little geometric shapes land on these bulbs. And if it's the right shape, this is where my work really changed over the last few years. I started looking at the fact that it's not just homology and the analogs and stuff we were looking at in terms of venom. It really comes down to geometric shape of things. If something fits into circuitry, if it can slot in, if it like sometimes I use Lego to show this, but basically here's an example, right? So you have a shape over here, you have another shape over here, and that way it won't work, right? But that way clicks in, okay? So the same thing, and so you have things called allosteric modulators, ivermectin being one of them, right? So if it's not fitting in that way, and then you put a jointed piece, then all of a sudden it'll click in. So fascinating is that everybody that discounted our venom work and said, and we had to keep telling people we weren't actually talking about venom, and we're talking about analogs, and we're talking about sequences, but it goes even further than that, because really what we're coming down to is that it comes down to shape, comes down to building things that can do the same function, so trigger those switches. And then my last point that I want to say about that is the guy that was the most interested in bringing this to fruition and using the olfactory bulb and using the vagal nerve and using it as a bioweapon was none other than Jeffrey Epstein. That's the connecting piece to when we've all seen what's taken place over the last 6 years. And people say, well, nobody could organize something like this and it would mean collusion and everybody would have to be lying about it. No, that's not what you need. You just need a connecting point. You need somebody that is connecting the military and BARDA and Moderna, and you need a connection point to then the universities, DARPA, and so you need that person who is the intermediary and the person that is putting these conferences together and finding the right people and then tapping them for stuff. So that's a pretty scary component to it, but it's also a giveaway in terms of understanding, what they're trying to do and why they're doing it. And so, I think you just asked me for an introduction, but that was all of that.
No, I love it. Let's dive into the copper thing that you were on top of early on. Actually, copper was one of the topics I was asked to speak on in England this last week. So I did an entire 1-hour presentation on the copper's roles in health. And I have to tell you, I don't know if you've seen these research studies, but maybe you have. I was super excited to show the whole world live watching this thing as I presented, and those that were in person, that there have actually been, since 2011, research studies by Barkow is his last name. And they took 18 micrometers sized copper molecules and put them in a breast milk filter and a breast pump in Africa Did you know the most common way for all children to get infected with HIV is through the breast milk? So this guy took 18 micrometer size nanoparticles of copper, put it in the breast milk filter. 100% of all HIV virus was destroyed in less than 5 minutes. And then he said this in 2011. If I can shrink down the size of this copper molecule to 1 micrometer, I think mathematically, he says, mathematically, we should be able to neutralize and destroy and kill all infectious HIV viral particles in less than 14 seconds. Well, I show in the research study that was done after he made that claim, they actually got it down to 1 micrometer. Copper destroyed HIV in 15 seconds. Killed it.
Doesn't surprise me.
Copper was.
I mean, we know that the HIV has GP120, and there's your venom analog.
There's your venom. And I quote, it is identical to bungarotoxin, which is crate snake venom, one of the 2 first isolated, DNA analyzed, confirmed analogs of the spike protein of COVID. It was cobra toxin and bungarotoxin, which is also on the rabies virus, HIV's GP120, SARS-CoV-2, one of their 2 S1, S2 proteins. Anyway, pretty ridiculous that all these viruses have the same crate snake, Chinese snake venom protein, making it so deadly and toxic. Crazy.
Well, I'll help. Please, I look forward to seeing that research. But you obviously know that I brought out copperine and it's back.
Please educate us on this new device, man.
The reformulated. It's now got myrrh in it. Myrrh has anti-inflammatory properties. A couple of reasons I brought it back. One of which is the prion. Well, and part of it was understanding that I had looked at, and I know you have too, in terms of replication of the spike protein, in terms of biofilm, and in terms of bacteria and fungi. You and I were talking about the fact that this didn't look like it was replicating as a virus. That if they were building it in bioreactors and using yeast and bacteria, then why wouldn't our bodies be doing the same thing, right? So we saw that years ago. That's finally catching up. There's papers coming out that show that. I think it's going to go a step further in that the bacteria is involved, but you cannot actually make the spike protein without bacteria and the yeast together. They are commensal. They live together in biofilm. A couple of things happen over there. When they form a symbiotic colony, they don't fight it out. What they'll end up doing is sharing resources. Evolutionary, you leave that biofilm for long enough and the right mix of it, that becomes a venom gland, right? That's how venom is made. People are like, venom is not one thing, it's a cocktail. Okay, so then who's making it? And how it's made is it's made in a colony, and that colony is filled with bacteria and yeast and the right set of circumstances. And then they package it. That stuff goes out, goes into exosomes, goes around the body, and those exosomes shed. And people say that shedding doesn't exist. Well, go lick a poison dart frog. Let me know how you do. Okay. Of course, it's shedding. I know we've got very limited time, so I'm going to give you a really quick bullet points of stuff that I'm currently very excited about, and that you either know or don't know about, but we can either follow up on. But I think your audience will be interested in some of my new discoveries. Right. 1, there is no SARS-CoV-2. Does not exist. Okay. So then what did everyone have? Okay. We don't exactly know. Couple of things that hopefully we have, that I have certainty on one day. I don't know that I'll ever have complete certainty. Plausible. In 2019, Moderna started injecting mRNA into cancer patients as part of a third phase clinical trial. They had done limited work before that. What they were doing is they were extracting toxins from cancer. They were then putting that back into the patient in lipid nanoparticles, up to 20 sequences of toxins, right? So you're already starting to sound like this is looking very similar to that long thing that they call SARS-CoV-2. Antigens plus a 19 nucleotide sequence plus lipid nanoparticles. And they were injecting that into those cancer patients. If you think about, if you want to experiment with a bioweapon and you've got military contracts, and you are essentially manufacturing something that's going to depopulate the planet, you not only need to test your product and see how it's going to work and how fast it kills and who it doesn't kill. You're going to need to test your manufacturing processes and how quickly you can do that. So that was Zika. Moderna actually tested out their stuff during Zika as part of their requirements with BARDA for biodefense. And then I think what happened in 2019 is that from July of 2019, they paired that mRNA product with a drug called Keytruda, which is known as a checkpoint inhibitor. And now you have gut dysbiosis, and you have exosomes being packaged, and you got nothing to stop shedding from those cancer patients. They're immune compromised. They've got this checkpoint inhibitor. They're packaging up these 20 antigens of lethal toxins. And so there's a possibility that when you look at the dates, or when you look at when people start thinking something was happening, people around North Carolina were getting sick, people in Massachusetts were getting sick, it is possible that the early inklings of what became known as COVID were shedding from that mRNA product, right? That's one plausible part to what people were experiencing in 2020. The other possibility I always leave room for, matching the data, is that in 2020, until they started putting out the testing COVID vaccines, statistically, and the data shows, we didn't actually have a problem. And that what we really had is lockdowns that caused all the illnesses. It took me back to my psychology roots recently. I was thinking about some times where I learned about the relationship between the mind body and how strong that is. There was a young girl once who had she was paralyzed, but nothing physical. Like there was no physical condition that was causing the paralysis. And through a therapy session with her, I brought in it was actually somebody had carved me a wooden stick. Guess what was wrapped around that wooden stick? The snake. A schizophrenic patient had given me this walking stick once, and I brought it to her, and I told her where did it come from. And I said, this guy had given me this healing stick, and why don't you go ahead and why don't you try and use it and see if it helps you to walk? And I was just referring to it actually like just, helping her out of a wheelchair. But actually what it did through that whole ritualized experience and through essentially her body getting permission to start walking again, she was walking down the corridor an hour later. Now, awesome. A lot of people can say that those kind of psychosomatic or fictitious disorders, a lot of people can say, well, they were faking it. But the difference between faking it is that if you take somebody whose body is locked into that state, you could put them out in the road and a car's going to run them over and they're not going to get up. But the body is really weird in terms of the circuitry, is that if it gets locked into a state for whatever reason, it needs something to unlock it. And that can be as powerful as belief for some people, right? That is one story that I came back to recently as the mindset for COVID in 2020. And the other one was me realizing that when you going through disease and everything that they did in terms of the lockdowns, the increased mold that people would be breathing in, not getting the sunlight, the isolation, all of that stuff, that in itself, all of that over time is enough to cause disease, as you know, right? So I started looking at the fact of what potentially happened in 2020. I also leave room for the fact of a bioweapon like VX agent, which is similar to the spike protein being used. But this is where I want to take a twist with you, as we probably only have like maybe 10 minutes left. But I want to bring you something that I think is big. A researcher called Steve Massey, I believe his paper is 2023. He looks at SARS-CoV-2, and he says, okay, everybody's talking about how similar the SARS-CoV-2 is to a virus called rat G13. Okay. Closest match to what they call that sequence, that long sequence that they've got, closest match, right? 96% the same, rat G13. Steve Massey looks at this thing and he looks to see where they found it, how they isolated it. It turns out it's a couple of things that are huge with it. One is that it came from the 2012 copper mine in Yunnan province, where 6 workers had gone in to clean bat guano, which is bat shit. Out of the 6 workers, 3 died. Okay. That's big, right? In terms of lethality.
It's like Ebola.
What was that?
50% death rate.
Yeah, 50% death rate, right? So what did they die of? If you have a look at everything that they looked at, their blood work, their scans, all of it, what did they die of? They died of COVID. Right? It matches the pathology 100%, even to the point that they have the ground glass opacities. Everything is there. These workers go in, they land up with this SARS-like disease, they land up with this pneumonia, and out of Wuhan Institute of Virology, they say what killed them was fungal. Okay, make note of that because we know fungus is involved. So they realize that fungus is involved. And that it's similar to histoplasmosis in terms of it taking over the body. Then they send back numerous times over a couple of years, from 2012 onwards. They send people from Wuhan Institute of Virology. They send them back to keep sampling that bat guano. A sample comes out of that same copper mine, and it is called rat G13. And Steve Massey looks at that sample and he goes, this is very interesting because they normally find these things that they call coronaviruses, and which I call prompts. That's the way that I now define viruses. Just code that makes a molecular change in the body. And Steve Massey looks at this and goes, this is weird. This is not from a bat. This is not a bat fecal sample. This is not bat fecal sample. This is a vaginal plug. Okay. Now,
very different than bat poop.
Very different from bat poop, right? But same copper mine.
Unless they make vaginal plugs with bat poop.
Same guano bat poop with a vaginal plug in it. So this is all new to me in terms of how I don't know much about bat biology, but here's something that horseshoe bats do, and this is where the sample comes from. Horseshoe bats, the female mates, she gets sperm in her. It does not impregnate her. It sets off a complete cascading system that creates a copulatory plug that essentially deactivates the sperm, preserves it, holds it in place throughout the entire hibernation time.
Wow.
Okay. In that sample is rat G13, which I believe is the code that switches that process on.
Got it.
So connecting the dots over here, you now have this code that sets off what I've defined SARS-CoV-2's pathology as, which is hibernation torpor, envenomation, and immune tolerance. All 3 of those circuits would be set off by rat G13. Okay, so if you think about what they've done with their vaccine, with their spike protein, they have inserted something in human beings that set off the molecular cascade to create a mucus plug, to hold a foreign protein and preserve it and allow it to live in the body. Now, crazy thing is, I said it only matched, I think it was 96% of the sequence. So what's missing? What's missing is Moderna's 19 nucleotide sequence that everybody refers to as BARAC, which is BARAC/Moderna/NIH/BARDA. This tiny 19 nucleotide sequence plus rat G13 is what we know as SARS-CoV-2. Wow. And rat G13 in the human body wouldn't be much issue. It wouldn't set off those cascades if it didn't have the furin cleavage site and that cobra analog that you and I looked at.
Yep.
All right. You combine both of those and you set off this complete cascade that forms that tricks the body into believing that it's hibernating, that there's an envenomation occurring, and that there is immune tolerance, which is needed in human beings for pregnancy, so that the growing fetus and embryo is not attacked because it's foreign DNA. And in a bat, what that would be needed for, and why you don't need the furin cleavage site in RG13, is the reproductive tract is filled with furin. So you've got a natural environment where that is coexisting and built for that. And now you take that out, but now it's not going to work.
You need a furin cleavage site
until you put the furin cleavage site in. So a couple of things can be learned from this. One is that there is no SARS-CoV-2 in nature, because you're not going to find it with a furin cleavage site. And everybody knows that already, but they call that the lab leak. That's not the lab leak. What that was is, why don't we take this thing that allows for the preservation of foreign proteins, which we need because we want to put foreign proteins in you with our mRNA. So why don't we take this that allows mRNA to work? And why don't we combine it with furin? Otherwise, it's not going to work. So there is no lab leak. What it's called is mRNA. So the entire thing, as we know commercially, was to bring out mRNA. But what I've discovered is it goes beyond just the pathway commercially. It's needed to make the thing work, right? And now when I talk about the thing work, the scariest part about all of this is that there's two main lines that I'm currently looking at. One of which is that clearly we are under a depopulation strategy. I believe that that's going to escalate hugely from 2030 onwards once they introduce 6G, which is why President Trump is pushing for it. He just put out a moratorium of understanding about multiple agencies and commercial interests to speed up and making sure that they hit that 2030 deadline. And the combination with 6G and sun dimming activates the 19 nucleotide sequence. Why? Because you're talking about hibernation. You're talking about a stressed environment. The reason that RATG13 is so unique is that it comes from a copper mine. What did we just say copper does? It kills stuff, right? So you have a fungal chain that they found, right, from the bat guano. They found a fungal chain, and they combined that with RATG13. When 6G activates and sun dimming happens, you will see the real pandemic beginning. I don't have a time frame.
This sounds like gain of function.
Yeah,
let's just make this thing more deadly.
Right. The other
aspect, no one's funding that stuff.
The other crazy part to this is that I know people have been fascinated by graphene oxide, and there's been so much discussion, and some people say they found it. What I think is more plausible, and now that I understand what these sequences really do, is if you want to start introducing graphene oxide into the human body, or getting the body to actually build graphene oxide, it would not survive. But if you put in a gene repair circuit, if you put in a sequence that's a DNA repair gene, which is what that 19 nucleotide sequence is, if it transcribes one way, it's going to repair DNA, and you're going to get longevity. If you transcribe it the other way, you basically got a kill switch. If you want human beings to have graphene oxide in them, if you want them connected to the body of Internet of Things, and you want them to become a human battery, and you need them to survive with copious amounts of graphene oxide in them, you need to start introducing that sequence and make it part of the human genome. That is what I believe long-term thereafter, as part of the depopulation wave and as part of making us essentially cyborgs.
That's some incredible research you put together there. I really have not read Massey's work. I'd love to look at that information too. I'll dive into that too. Yep. But I think this is right up our alley, what we've been trying to gain from being on the outside looking in on these individuals, these organizations trying to build scaffolds on top of deadly toxins and how to make them more destructive in the human body, hibernate for a period, be activated by frequencies, radio towers, 5G, 6G, you name it. that could be a part of the hibernation and then activation using those technologies. And then in the 2030 scheme of things, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Have you not seen 200 countries around the world in unison right now have actively started banning all tobacco and nicotine agents by the year 2030? The year is specific, all of them, 2030. You cannot have this commercially available to your citizens in 200 countries.
You got to add one more to that list. They are at war with copper.
Oh,
so they are replacing obviously copper pipes from houses, and they're giving you microplastics. They are trying to tell people that copper is toxic. There's a bunch of people out there, including influencers, that don't understand copper at all, and they are starting to scare people. They are also, if you connect the dots on this, not only do you need the right levels of copper in your body regularly, right? But if you have introduced sequences of the body that are sequestering copper, that are messing up copper in terms of dysregulation, and also if that is all taking place because the sequences have come from a copper mine, this is even more important to understand copper. Now with copperine, and I don't know if you want to put a link on it or just say it verbally, people can get a discount on it at Ardis 10.
Yeah, put in ARDIS 10. Now tell them where to go to get copperine.
Copperine.com, 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 or otherwise find me and Dr. Tau Braun, and my stuff will have a link to it. I want to make this is a great place because your audience is very savvy. I know a lot of your audience is already using copperine. The testimonials that I've got are absolutely incredible. I have to be very careful about what I say about it in terms of claims. We know that copper is antimicrobial. We know it's antiviral, and we know that it is antifungal. But what I want people to understand in terms of my original intention with this, and when I built it, were things like, how do you deactivate venom? But now what I'm also interested in is we have huge amounts of biofilm within those nasal passages. And we know that fungi and bacteria live in those nasal passages. We know that it's a reservoir for spike protein. And we know that you need to be able to get back into those places, right? Differently from other nasal rinses, which are great, differently from other products that are great. I want people to understand that part of the reason that I'm super excited about this is that this is easy for travel with, differently from at an airport or at a big conference or something where you're not going to want to sit there with a big nasal spray, putting it in your nose like that. Those products are great. They work nicely with this too. But this is something that someone can keep in their pocket. They can mist up like this. And importantly, you are putting the copper where it needs to be to mitigate against the risk of actually where that whole system is triggering from. Right. So that's one of the benefits. This is not a replacement. I know you've got a great copper product. This is not a replacement for two things. Not a replacement for copper-based foods, things like beef liver. All right. Really important. Even dark chocolate. Right. If you're not a liver fan. But it's also not a replacement for supplements, because this is built to have extremely low levels of everything that's in here, including the copper and zinc that's in here, because you do not want the toxicity on those areas. And so it is not to try and put copper back in the body. It is a nasal hydration and nasal mist that is copper and zinc based. And so that's a really good opportunity to really help people to understand that they're not doing this instead of some of those other great products that are out there.
Plus, the delivery system's different. You're going into the nasal passages, into the lungs directly. The blood's on the inside of that, and of course, the biofilm inside those passages, which is great. Also, I'll just throw it out there in case you guys are wondering, what's the issue with copper and zinc? Why is it so important? In the UK, while I was there, I did a whole presentation and put up on the screen Monsanto's own publications on glyphosate chelating zinc and copper out of your soil. It's no longer in your food supply. You are now zinc and copper deficient, perfectly equipped 30, 40 years ahead of time for the pandemic, which was going to target cells more easily with a copper and zinc deficiency. They just created a society all around the world of those exposed to that chemical in their agriculture. you are now zinc and copper deficient. And you need copper to produce ATP in every mitochondria in your cell, leading to chronic fatigue when you're deficient. For all those who don't have enough copper, and then also copper is required by every mitochondria in every cell to produce hydrogen peroxide, which kills venom, bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. So you are now immune compromised without copper. You might as well start introducing some zinc and copper nanoparticles, the way you put those into your copperine, which I'm very, very excited about. Dr. Tau Braun, I'm going to have to go. It's time to go help my wife. We've got something we've got to go do as a family. All right. Thank you very much for your research and coming out and joining us again. And thank you for being a humanitarian. And thank you for speaking truth, even in the face of adversity, controversy, and being, ostracized, like some of us have attempted to be. God bless you, Tau. Appreciate you, buddy.
You too.
And we will see you next time on the Dr. Ardis Show. All right, buddy. See you.
Disclaimer. Please note, the following presentation is solely for informational purposes and should not be seen as a replacement for advice provided by your physician. It is important not to rely on the information from this presentation for diagnosis, treatment, medication prescription, or any other form of medical care. Always consult with your physician or healthcare professionals before taking any medication, nutritional supplement, herbal remedy, homeopathic treatment, or pursuing any health-related procedure. If you have a medical condition or believe you might have one, promptly contact your healthcare provider. Do not disregard professional medical advice or delay seeking it based on this presentation's information as the products or services purchased from it do not establish a doctor-patient relationship between you and any affiliated physicians. Statements about dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.